Fellowship sweet, we will sit at his feet, or will walk by his side in the way. What he says we will do, where he sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.
If you have a Bible, please turn to 2 Corinthians, the letter of 2 Corinthians, and that's where our text will come from today. Thank you for being here. I hope you realize that your presence here today is not only meant to be a comfort to you, but is bringing comfort right now to someone else who's in this room. And part of the comfort that you give was from the songs that you just sang. Thank you for singing out. John, thank you for picking those particular songs today that have given us a chance to sing to each other, to speak to each other, to praise God. Darren, thank you for leading us before our communion and reminding us of how when we take that meal, we are inviting Jesus. We are remembering him. We're bringing him into our presence. And that is meant to bring us comfort. But there is something about doing that together that's important. And I think that's what we'll find in our passage today. 2 Corinthians is actually a letter. It was written by Paul and Timothy about 2,000 years ago to a group of Christians who lived in the city of Corinth. 2 Corinthians is special to me because this is the first book of the Bible that I ever read from start to finish. And it opened my eyes to the incredible world that is hidden within Scripture, and which you do not see when you simply jump from one verse to the other. I was 16 years old and had just picked up the Bible and thought, well, I'm going to read one of these books straight through. And there at 16, I, of course, picked one of the shorter ones that I could find, and it happened to be 2 Corinthians. But it was about the time that I got into chapter 3, chapter 4, and then certainly by 5, I pulled out my pen, and if you look at my old Bible from when I was 16, 2 Corinthians is not just marked up, it is not just underlined, it is over-marked. I have certain passages that I underlined, and then I highlighted, and then beside it I have annotated with other thoughts, and it's fun to go back and read that Bible. I'd like to introduce you to that letter today. And the encouragement, as you've heard me say before, is that you go and read the whole letter. This is just the teaser. I'm going to read you the opening lines and show you what you find there. But I think what you find in those opening lines, you should hear as an invitation to read the entire letter. And you could do that in just probably 15 minutes this afternoon when you get home. So 2 Corinthians, it's in the New Testament. This letter was written back in the 50s. And by that, during the 1950s, it was actually the AD 50s when it was first written. But it was written to a city, and it was written specifically to Christians in a city that is very much like Anchorage. Corinth was a port city. If anything merchandise-wise was moved throughout the Mediterranean world, it went through across this isthmus that was right beside Corinth, which is in southern Greece. Because of that, there were cultures in Corinth from all over the world. It was a mix of ideas and cultures and religions. And so very much like Anchorage, if you're going to take merchandise anywhere from the west to the east, the planes land right out here in Anchorage. And most of you know that Anchorage is a mix of cultures and ideas and even religions throughout the world. And so if Paul were writing this letter today, the very congregation the letter would be addressed to would be to the Christians living in Anchorage and all of Alaska, he would say, as he begins. And so it's exciting for me to introduce to you this letter. Now, to understand one of the main words that you see in the very first part of Corinthians, though, it's important to understand the word comfort. And I thought one of the ways to help grapple with and maybe understand the word comfort, we would talk about church chairs. Because I understand the elders have told us that sometime this year we are looking at replacing the church seating, even in here. And that may be with a chair style that you've seen, in congregations they'll have interlocking chairs. It may be with other pews like this. The elders have sought our input on that, and if you have not solicited your input on your preferences, this would be a great time to do that in terms of what you would prefer. But because we were moving that direction, I thought, well, let me go online and see what's available. I mean, what kinds of chairs are even available for congregations, and what are the selling points? What are the features of a church chair that we should look for? And do you know one of the main selling features for church seating is comfort? Because whether or not, it doesn't matter if it's a pew or a chair, the real question is it comfortable? And so I found this one ad I thought you would enjoy. You can almost hear these words being stated over a radio broadcast, on a Christian radio station, or somebody who's trying to sell you the chairs. Whatever your reasons are for attending church service, comfortable church chairs may provide some form of encouragement. Although most people may not want to admit this as one of the reasons for going to church, it certainly does have an effect. Surely you won't want to be, or you won't be too inclined to go back often to a place of discomfort unless you intend to do it as a regular sacrifice. Therefore, buy our chairs and worship in comfort. I'm not recommending that we use this as an advertisement. But what caught my eye about this particular advertisement was early on in the statement there where it says that comfortable chairs provide some form of encouragement. It's recognizing that one of the reasons that people come to a church service is to seek comfort, is to seek encouragement. And they're just saying, well, why not do that in comfort? Certainly one of the reasons that the church exists is to provide comfort to a community. One of the reasons that you are here doing this together is to provide comfort for what ails our community. But what happens when those who are called to provide comfort are the ones who need comfort? What happens when you here today, who are called by God and commissioned by God to provide comfort in Anchorage, to address the real problems in Anchorage, what happens when you are the one who needs help? When you are the one who needs relief and needs someone to lift the load? Well, I think that's where we recognize that the comfort of a chair, the comfort of a pew, is not what we mean when we say that the church provides comfort. Comfort could mean one of three different things. Usually when we talk about an item being comfortable, we're referring to this first definition, which is a state of physical ease or freedom from pain or constraint. So if I say that a chair is comfortable, what I mean is I can sit in it for an extended period of time without feeling pain or constraint. And this can actually get out of control. I mean, you've been to the movies recently, and you see one of the advertisements is, come see the movie in comfort seating, which to me you're getting way too close to a line that feels like home. When you sit in the seats in the modern theater that actually recline, they're big leather seats that will fully recline. There's a heater in the seat itself. I'm having trouble with the idea of paying $15 now to see a movie that I'm not even going to be able to stay awake through. And do you know that there are some manufacturers of church seating that actually are advertising that movie-style seating? Can you imagine that? Yeah. I was thinking what that ad would say. Come hear a sermon from which some people, rise greatly encouraged, other people wake from it greatly refreshed. If that's what we mean by comfort that you receive from church, then obviously we've missed the point. Comfort could mean the second definition, which is the easing or alleviation of a person's feelings of grief or distress. Those of you who are involved in the medical profession know this is much of what we do. When a person is ill, we give medicine to relieve suffering, to relieve pain. We give medicine not only for physical pain, but also medicine to relieve psychiatric pain or psychological pain. And so to relieve that pain is to render comfort. But then there's a third definition, and I wanted to make sure you heard this definition. The third definition of comfort is that it could be a person or thing that helps to alleviate a difficult situation. The key word there is a person, or perhaps a thing. In other words, comfort can mean not just what's given to you, comfort can be the actual person who is providing it. And we say that is a person of comfort. And if you understand that third definition, then if I take you back to ancient Corinth, the word will make more sense. So if Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and if he were to use the word comfort, the word he would use is the word parakaleo. And that word simply means to call alongside. You might even hear those two words within the actual word parakaleo, the word call, kaleo, and then para, to put beside. You've heard that word parallel. Parallel just means to bring alongside. We were at the high school track races yesterday, and if I said I saw two, people running in parallel to one another, you know what comes to mind is running down the track side by side together, and that's what the word para, together, or alongside. Para means alongside. Alelos means together. So to run alongside each other is to run parallel. It's the same word here, but instead of to run alongside, parakaleo means to call alongside. And that's the word that in Corinth would be used to say comfort. Comfort is to call alongside, not to simply encourage someone or to say it's going to be okay. It's not to hand someone a remedy for pain. If you wrote to the church in Corinth and said, how comfortable are your seating arrangement in that church, which happened to be right next to the synagogue, and you use the word comfort, it would not make sense to them if you were talking about their seating. When they used the word comfort, it was this term, call alongside. The real comfort comes not from what's given, but by the fact that the person who is giving it is right there. Does that make sense? If so, then the passage that we read will come to life. So if we read 2 Corinthians, starting in chapter 1, you'll recognize that Paul begins the letter like he does most. In that day and time, you would begin your letter by identifying who's writing the letter. And so it begins by saying, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. So Paul and Timothy are writing this letter to the church of God that is at Corinth, with all the saints who are in the whole of Achaia, which is the southern part of what is now Greece. So it's written to the church in Corinth, but it was meant to be passed around. It is to all the Christians, those who follow Christ in that whole region. And then Paul gives his prayer, grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ. And then he begins the main part of the letter with a prayer. And oftentimes Paul does this with most of his letters. And the prayer he gives says this, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. Now I'm going to read the rest of this, and I want you to catch just how many times he uses the word, or maybe overuses the word comfort, and see if this doesn't come to light. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's suffering, so through Christ we share abundantly in comfort too. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort. I haven't counted it. Did somebody count how many times he uses the word comfort? 10? Is that okay? So I had a lot. I didn't know if that was cheering or no. You're saying 10. Yeah. So 10 times he uses this word comfort. And as we read that through, if you fill in the blank or if you use the definition of word comfort to mean something like God is providing me with encouragement or a hang in there or a remedy, then you'll miss the point. Because what Paul is saying here, using parakaleo, the word that was in Corinth understood to mean calling alongside, what Paul is saying is that God has called us alongside himself. You know, there's a big difference between encouragement of patting somebody on the back or even giving them some type of aid compared to saying, stand right here beside me. When we're watching a scary movie at home, like 101 Dalmatians. The other day we pulled out that video and I popped it in, and Martin, our 3-year-old, said, "Dad, there's a scary part." I said, "Really?" And he pointed on the cover, and he pointed to Cruella de Vil, you know. Well, when Cruella de Vil comes out, I could say, okay, we're going to turn it off. That'd be one way. But no, what do I say? During the scary part, I say to Martin, come, sit here with me. That's that idea of parakaleo. And when we run into those scary parts of life, what Paul's saying here is that the God of all calling alongside calls, Paul felt this, called me alongside him and said, stand here. Now, I'd like to reread this passage, but I'm going to fill in the word comfort with what that word means, and see if it doesn't come alive for you a little more. So let's read this again. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all, calling alongside himself, who calls us alongside in our affliction, so that we may be able to call alongside all who are in any affliction, with the same calling alongside with which we ourselves are called alongside by God. For as we share abundantly in Christ's sufferings, so through Christ we share abundantly in the calling alongside of others too. If we are afflicted, it is so that we may call you alongside and for your salvation. And if we are called alongside, it is so you can be called alongside, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we suffer. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our calling alongside with God. Do you see how that comes alive? And that's how Paul begins his letter, saying that God is the God of all comfort who has called us to his side. And does that make a difference? Paul says it certainly does. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction that we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Now, you'll read about some of these afflictions if you read through the book of Acts. We don't know exactly what Paul is referring to here, but he says, while we were in Asia, we were under such affliction that we thought that we were about to die. One example of that may be in Acts 19, when in Ephesus, Paul is preaching. He had been there for some time, and there was a local business owner, Demetrius, who made idols of Artemis. And because Paul was preaching that what they were making were not really gods, they were just pieces of metal that people were pretending actually had control of something, Paul was saying that's actually a lie. Well, that made the business owners upset, because Ephesus was the seat of the worship of Artemis. Artemis of the Ephesians. They believed that a stone had come out of the sky and had landed there, and it was a gift. And from that gift came the power of Ephesus over that region. And so you could go to Ephesus and buy little figurines of Artemis, or big figurines, and put them in your house for your morning devotional. And so this was big business, and Paul threatened the economy of Ephesus. And so these business owners instigated or started a smear campaign and a political campaign against Paul and against the Christians. And they ended up causing a riot. They got enough people together. In fact, it ended up being several thousands of people that rushed into the theater that was there. So it would be like a major part of Anchorage all going to the Sullivan Arena or over to the arena on the UAA campus. And imagine an arena like that just filled with people from all over the city, and all of them shouting and yelling because these people who are preaching Christ are going to destroy our economy. The riot got so bad that they thought that some of the Christians were going to be killed. Paul wanted to break into the middle. Now, we don't know if he wanted to break in to protect the Christians, or more likely because how often do you get a congregation of thousands of people together to give them the gospel? That's what Paul would have done, is to stand up and preach the sermon. But the Christians kept him out of the arena. They would not let him go in. In fact, we're told that some of the archons, or the rulers of that area, the Greek leaders, would not let Paul go in. They kept him from going in. And finally, it was a city manager who went in and told the people that they were at risk of being accused of rioting, that the problem was a political problem or a business problem. And in Acts 19, he actually tells the people, the courts are open right now. Take your case to the court and let's argue it there. And so he dissipates the crowd. Well, that's what was going on in Ephesus. And Paul refers to some situation like that, where time after time and city after city, they are oppressed and not just told that they can't speak or that they should keep their beliefs to themselves. This was Paul being thrown in prison. They were beat for preaching the gospel. They were ridiculed. And Paul says, we came to the point of feeling like we were this close to death. Now, put yourself into that same situation. Paul's identifying with anybody who feels that because of the situation in life that they're in, that they're at the point of death. And some of you know what that weight feels like. And Paul says, I'm with you. I know what it's like to get to that point of feeling like we despair of life itself. And then Paul says, indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. And then he gives you the reason why. Why is it that a good and loving God would allow people to suffer to this point of despairing of life? He says that was to make us rely not on ourselves. John, thanks for bringing that point out so powerfully. That God allowed Paul says, I can't say this is true for all of you. I'm just telling you, for me, he allowed this to happen so that we would not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Now think of all the things Paul could have relied on. We do this all the time when we are oppressed, when we are in a situation, when we despair, and we say, if I just had the money to take care of this, I could get out of this situation. If I just completed this degree, if things were right in this relationship, if someone would just acknowledge the work that I'm doing, this whatever could be lifted. There are many places that we tend to run when we're oppressed, many things that we tend to rely on. And Paul says we constantly were brought closer and closer to this brink of death so that we would stop trying to rely on ourselves and solve the problem, and instead rely on God. And notice how he says, rely on God, and then he gives you the descriptive phrase, not just any God, but the God who raises the dead. God brought us to the point of feeling like we were at the point of death so that we would rely on, don't miss this, rely on the God who raises the dead. That's what drove Paul. That's what compelled him, because he remembered Jesus, who raised the dead. Jesus, who looks at a tomb of Lazarus, a guy who had been dead for 4 days, and says, come forth, and out comes Lazarus. You remember the story of Jesus raising the little girl, Jairus' daughter. Jairus went to Jesus and said, my girl is sick, please come. And as they go to his house, the servants come and say, don't bother Jesus, your daughter's dead. But Jesus leans over to Jairus and whispers in his ear, don't be afraid, just believe. And then Jesus goes to his house, and you remember what happened when they show up at the house. Everybody's in mourning, but Jesus walks into the room with the parents, and he grabs the little girl's hand and says, Talitha koum, which means, I say, little girl, get up. And immediately her eyes open, and she gets up. And you know what Jesus said next? He said, give her something to eat. While everyone else stood around amazed, she's alive. And Paul says, God brought us to this point of death so that we would not rely on ourselves, but we would rely on the God who raises the dead. Now you know that there is a force in this universe that has the power to create life. I think all of you believe that. Those of you who believe that that is the living God know that at the beginning of time, God said, "Let there be light." There was light, and then what followed was the creation of life. But even people in our community who don't believe God did that, even if their entire faith is in time and chance, if it's a naturalistic perspective, you still believe that there are forces in the universe that have the ability over time, over an infinite number of beneficial chances to bring forth life. Everybody believes that there is a force in this world that can create and bring life. What has been considered foolish and a stumbling block from the beginning is the statement by a few that there is also a force in this universe that can bring dead people back to life. And that's what Paul points to here. That we were brought to the point of putting our reliance not just on ourselves, but on a force that not only gives life, but a force that can bring people back from the dead. Do you know who Johnny Hart is? Have you heard that name? He's the comic artist who wrote BC Comics back in the day. And every Easter, he would always have an Easter theme to his comics. And one of them, for some reason, this stood out to me. I think I read this back when I was in college, but he came out with one on Easter Sunday, and he has his peg-leg poet write this poem about Easter, in which he says, "Man, magnificent man, creates forces that outshines the stars. He can shoot himself up and tap dance on the moon or hurl himself clear out to Mars. He can unleash a force that evaporates steel, since he's learned how the atom behaves. But he has no recourse but to bow to the force that summons the dead from their graves." He got the point of Easter, is that our reliance is on the one who raises the dead. And Paul says, when our reliance is on the being in this universe who has the power to raise the dead, there is no other problem that you face that you have to worry about. Now, I'd like to show you an example of how that plays out in real life, and I asked for permission to tell you this story. This is, in the middle, is a picture of our daughter, Ada. Ada is a mission-minded young woman who, since age 12, has gone with us every year to the country of Haiti. And every year that we go down, I notice something, that whenever we're in Haiti, Ada is a child magnet. And we'll be working in these rural clinics, and I'll look over trying to, where's Ada? And all you have to do is look for the crowd of children, because she instantly, like we said earlier, calls alongside or pulls alongside all the children of a community, and they crowd around her, and she spends time with them. Sorry, Ada, my brain just suddenly jumped to other stories there, but there's one time where I lost Ada. I wasn't prepared to tell you this story, but it's not a good idea to call home and say, I can't find Ada. We're down here in Haiti. And, well, I had lost her at the clinic, but I looked outside and there was this huge crowd, and they were all pressing in, and I thought, oh no, Ada's right in the middle of all these kids who are pressing down on her. And apparently she had pulled out a snack or something and was sharing it, handing it, and of course everybody wanted some, so it caused one of those riots like Paul was in Ephesus. Her life was in danger, I knew. And so I was leaving outside the clinic to go outside where I saw this crowd, when suddenly the whole crowd stood up, and out of the middle came walking Ada, just walking, and they all just parted as she walked, and she was just singing a song. And now I forget what the song was, but as she sang, they all kind of went behind her. It's like the Pied Piper, they all just kind of followed alongside. But she loves going, and one of the things I noticed about her, and I wanted you to see, was this idea of what it means to comfort. It's that calling alongside. It's just her presence there that brings comfort to others. Well, 2 years ago, about a month before we were supposed to go to Haiti, Ada, I got a call from home that Ada was having a headache that was different than any one she had before. She had had headaches for some time, but this one had caused her vision to be lost on one side. So she had developed this condition with her headache that she couldn't see. From half the room was gone. Well, obviously that was concerning, so I came and took her to the emergency room. We talked to the doctors there, and they did an MRI scan of her head. Well, it turns out at that hospital, the radiologist is actually our neighbor. I mean, a guy who lives right next to us. And so I asked him, just for a personal favor, would you take a look at this and let me know what you think? Well, halfway through, Ada had not even come out from the MRI machine, and our neighbor came over and said, Bob, I want to show you something. And that's never a good sign. And he took me to his office and he showed me this picture. And we call this the positive arrow sign, because any medical student can figure out what's wrong. But you can look and see there was this collection of abnormal blood cells in this part of her brain on the left side that had started to bleed. They were causing worsening of headaches, and it probably led to the symptoms that she was having. And it set right on what's called the motor cortex, which means that part of the brain that controls the right side of her body. And most likely this would continue to bleed, lead to seizures later on. It's not cancer in the sense of a tumor that would grow in that way, but it was an abnormal collection of vessels that, if they continued to bleed, would cause problems. And so the recommendation was to get surgery. We were connected to a neurosurgeon down in Seattle, and within actually a couple weeks of that, we were down in Seattle, and she was scheduled for this brain surgery. Well, as we were preparing to go down for the surgery, I asked Ada if she understood the diagnosis, and she did. And I said, is there anything about this that scares you? And she smiled and says, no, I think it's exciting. And I said, really? I said, well, why do you think it's exciting? She said, they're going to do surgery on my brain, I said, yeah, but is there anything about that that's scary to you? And she noticed that what I was really saying was, Dad is scared about this. Does it scare you too? And she became the perfect daughter, and she looked over at me and she says, Dad, she goes, why would I be scared? And I said, I don't know. They're, be doing major surgery. You're going to be under anesthesia. We don't know what's going to happen afterwards. And she says, Dad, the worst thing that could happen to me is that I would die and go to heaven. Why would I be afraid? Boy, you can't provide greater comfort to a dad. But do you hear what she was saying? Is that I'm relying on the God who raises the dead. What do I have to be afraid of? Well, she went into the surgery, and right after surgery, the surgeon came up and said, those words that just really bring comfort, and saying that everything went fine. You can go down now and visit with her. And so after they had taken care of the abnormal lesion, they had taken her down to the recovery room, and I went into the recovery room, and there was Ada just waking up, sort of in that post-anesthesia fog. And she smiled at me, and I greeted her. And after a few minutes, she looked up and she says, Daddy, I know what that girl felt like who Jesus raised from the dead. And I said, really? Why is that? And she said, I'm hungry. And I leaned down and I kissed her and I said, Ada, now I know what her daddy felt like. What brings comfort is when we realize that we have put our faith in the God who raises the dead. What else do we have to fear? And what Paul says in this passage that we've been reading is that when you come to that point and you recognize that that is true, then God brings you alongside others. So with that comfort that you've received by standing side by side with God, you're able to bring others to stand side by side as well and provide that comfort. It was 5 weeks after the surgery, the surgeon gave permission for us to take Ada back down to Haiti. She insisted on going. She did not have the stamina to get out and play with other children, but she went to one of the orphanages. And then I received later that afternoon a texted photo, the one that you see here. It was Dr. Claren, one of the nurse practitioners who goes with us, and she said, I want you to see this. And she sent me this picture, and you'll notice in that picture, if you look close, on the top of Ada's head is the scar from her surgery. And you'll notice what she's doing 5 weeks after a major surgery is she's called a little boy named Vidley an orphan, a little boy who has no mom, no dad left, who has his own scars. And he's called into her lap, And this picture, since seeing it that day, in my mind, has been the snapshot photo that goes behind the verse that we just read. That the God of all comfort calls us alongside himself so that we, having been comforted by God, having that faith, are able to take others and call them alongside ourselves. And there you see two souls, both of them with their own scars, comforted because God put them in proximity with each other. Well, that's the first of three things that Paul wants you to see, actually two of the three, and that is that God comforts you in whatever you are working with or dealing with, so that you are being prepared to comfort others. And in this congregation are people that you are here, one, to receive comfort from by standing alongside, but also to give comfort to. And Paul ends this section by saying, God delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. And then he concludes with the final point, which is, you also must help us by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. And so Paul ends this passage by saying that you are here today as people who have been comforted, who have been brought side by side with God, so that you can be side by side and stand side by side with those in the community who need God's comfort. And it is knowing that God who raises the dead, the one standing next to you, gives you the ability to provide that comfort. And then Paul concludes by saying, but don't forget to pray for those who call you alongside themselves. Don't forget to pray for those who provide you comfort. And so the lesson ends today by a reminder, or with a reminder. Pray for those who provide you comfort. Pray for your parents. Husbands, pray for your wives who bring you comfort. Wives, pray for your husbands. Members of this congregation, pray for your elders. Pray for the teachers. Pray for those in the community who bring you comfort. Pray for those friends who stand side by side with you. Paul ends here by saying, remember to pray for each other. And so our lesson ends today with the three reminders. One, you have been comforted by God. Two, you've been comforted by the God who raises the dead. And three, remember to pray for each other. Well, I hope that will invite you to read the rest of 2 Corinthians and find those treasures that are throughout the book. But recognizing that many of you come today in need of comfort, we end actually this part of our lesson with an invitation for anyone who needs prayer, who says, I need you to pray for me today. We invite you to come forward. If you today say, I want this comfort in following Jesus, this day you can choose to follow him, to be baptized as a way of committing your life to him, of being buried and raised from the dead. You can choose to follow him today. And if those needs are yours, we invite you to come forward while we stand and while we sing.
In that resurrection morning, when the trump of God shall sound, no, we shall rise, hallelujah, we shall rise. Then the saints will come rejoicing, and no tears will e'er be. Now we shall rise, hallelujah, oh, we shall rise. We shall rise, hallelujah, we shall rise, amen. We shall rise in that resurrection morning when death's prison. Now we shall rise, hallelujah, oh, we shall rise.